virtual Zoom class. Thanks, Veronica. This course was intentionally designed to be freely available to the public. So we have some folks who are in the Zoom classroom who are registered to take this course for credit through UIC, and some folks who are volunteering their time to be here to learn in community. And we're all in community with one another. And I just want to thank you all for joining today, all 124 of us. For those of you who are not registered students, I'm going to call you all community members. So if you're here and you're not a registered student, you're a community member, can you just say, hey, say what's up in the chat? And again, thank you for volunteering your time. You all are welcome to attend each week of lectures and action labs this semester, or drop into whichever sessions feel most interesting to you. So we would love to see you in all the weeks, but also if you pick and choose, that's fine as well. And for those of you who are registered to take this course for credit, I'm going to call you all the registered students. Can you all say hey in the chat? I want to thank you all for choosing this class among the many others that you could have picked this semester. And I look forward to seeing you all every week this semester. So I am really excited for us all to journey together this spring. And as I mentioned, E of I began in 2017, which now brings us to the course's ninth year, which is very wild. And each year, the planning committee decides on a course theme to center us throughout the semester. And so you see here on this slide the themes from past years of the course. This year's theme is disenfranchisement, fugitivity, and charting a path towards freedom. This theme was decided on after a lot of back and forth discussion amongst the planning committee. As we came together to plan for this semester, we had to just sit with ourselves and ask ourselves, like, what are we doing? What do we need to be doing? And what responsibility do we have to the future students that are going to enroll in the course? And how can we center the historical roots of the course as we enter into its ninth year? And I probably don't have to, remind you all of the political moment that we find ourselves in at the federal level. Funny enough, the political moment that we're currently in felt, something like this when the course was first born 9 years ago. So we decided in this ninth year of the class to really return to the roots of the course. And that is to say, we decided to be intentional about centering histories of oppression, histories of struggle, and the complicated history of storytelling that shapes our understanding of both. So we use the word disenfranchisement in our theme intentionally, and we don't just mean voting. And we use the word fugitivity intentionally as well. What does the word really mean? I look forward to continued discussion about that as the semester goes on. And of course, we center freedom, or at least a path towards it, because if we know one thing about the history of this country, it's that the oppressed peoples here have never stopped charting their path towards freedom. So, last but not least, we want to highlight the class website. This course, because we are a class that is open to our community members and not only the registered students that are UIC students, we opt to conduct the class a bit differently. And so we have all of our materials available on our course Google site. The site is updated frequently and has the class schedule, the latest version of the class schedule, readings and resources, lecture slides, recordings, and more. And we'll talk more about the class site in future weeks. We want to make sure that everyone has access to it and that it's clear. And if you all have any questions about it at the present time, you can email Veronica, our course TA. And I am going to drop a link oop, to the Google site in the chat. I'm going to try to. I did it. Okay. Okay. And now for the moment that we've all been waiting for. I am really excited to introduce Dr. Rae Murray to lead us in our session one lecture, Introduction to Health Equity and Fugitivity. Dr. Murray is a longtime supporter of this course, and so we are so excited to have her back to do our first lecture of the semester. Dr. Rae Murray has spent her career serving the medically underserved. She has worked in a variety of settings, including medical director of the federally funded health center Winfield Moody, which served Cabrini Green Public Housing Project in Chicago, Residency Director for Occupational Medicine at Meharry Medical College, and Bureau Chief for the Chicago Department of Public Health under Mayor Harold Washington. Dr. Murray is the recently retired Chief Medical Officer for the Cook County Department of Public Health. She also practiced as a general internist at Woodlawn Health Center, was an attending physician in the Division of Occupational and Environmental Medicine at Cook County Hospital, and is an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health in the Occupational and Environmental Health and Health Policy and Administration divisions. Dr. Murray plays a leadership role in many organizations, including the National Association of City and County Health Officers, Health Equity and Social Justice Team, the National Executive Board of American Public Health Association, and serves on the board of the Chicago-based Health and Medicine Policy Research Group. In 2011, Dr. Murray served as president of the American Public Health Association. She is the co-chair for the Urban Health Program Community Advisory Committee at UIC. Dr. Murray has been a voice for social justice and healthcare as a basic human right for over 40 years. She remains passionate about increasing the number of Black and Latino health professionals. Now, I already know that Dr. Murray is going to take us on a journey together today, and I expect her comments to inspire a lot of thoughts and questions for us all. And so I again want to encourage you all to drop your comments and reflections in the chat as we listen. And we're going to have time at the end of our session, probably around 7:30, to ask questions and be in discussion with one another around what we've heard. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Dr. Murray, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, first of all, to everybody. And just to let you know, remind you, Tiffany, I've been retired for 10 years. I'm not recently retired. I'm proudly retired for 10 years. Anyway, let me get these slides up here. You know, my goal tonight is to get the course started and to raise some questions that hopefully you'll explore in the rest of the semester. So let me first start off by saying, especially to those of you who are registered for this course, I will make sure that Dr. Ford gets these slides and they'll be on the website so you can look at them so you don't have to worry about scribbling notes. The second thing I'm going to say is I'm going to do things you're not supposed to do when you lecture. I put a lot of suggestions for books in my slide set, which I always do every year. And again, you can go to the website and look at those there. I won't always talk about them, but I want you to know about it. I want to start off with Brother Malcolm, and this is one of my favorite quotes from Brother Malcolm, which is thinking is dangerous. But when we talk about what's going to happen next week, it's really critical that we think. But you should be aware that that's always a dangerous thing. I also have a land acknowledgement. I want to point out that this particular land acknowledgement, which I believe is the one that we place on the university's website, specifically talks about disenfranchisement. I'm going to come back to that. And I wanted to spend just a little time, because I think it's a perfect example for what we're talking about in this course, about what happened to indigenous peoples from the Great Lakes region in the past and what's going on today. So as you've heard in the short comments that Dr. Ford made. The Great Lakes, as you would expect from the geography setting, is really historically a hub where many different groups of Native Americans came over centuries to trade with each other. And so this is really a major hub for that. And really, the land began to be stolen, especially out of Chicago in 1832 and 1833 in the Black Hawk War. Yes, those Black Hawks that are apparently losing hockey games all the time. Um, so I wanted again to review because we have to pay attention to the particularities of what goes on. It's not enough just to say, oh, Native Americans got screwed. If you don't understand what happened and how it happened, then you really have no hope of addressing any kind of injustices. So we started, and we, the United States and the British, started violating treaties with indigenous people in this particular slide in 1776, where the Ohio River is set as the boundary. And even though I don't have time to talk about this, there are a number of historians who really believe that the American Revolution, rather than being a revolution of progress, was really a revolution to guarantee the stealing of indigenous land and a violation of agreements that the King of England had already made with with Native Americans. But in any case, so in 1795, uh, uh, they were two-thirds of present Ohio was captured, especially the transportation system, the Ohio River going to the Mississippi River, etc., the Illinois River. And in 1816, we had the Treaty of St. Louis, and you can see the tribal groups that were forced westward. In 1821, all of Southwest Michigan, uh, up through Chicago and Detroit, was used to build a road. 1829, another treaty that extended the land. In 1833, the Treaty of Chicago, where we ceded the last land in Illinois and Wisconsin. Just last year, or the year before that, I think it was 23 or 24, the Potawatomi, for the first time in centuries, actually have a piece of land in the state of Illinois. Um, but we don't have time to talk about that in detail. This again, this has a huge impact. It's easy if you're just sitting in the city to not realize what's going on around you. This is our interstate highway. These are also the traditional trails that the Native American troop people use to traverse the land. And probably the biggest single, other than the original stealing of the land, the biggest single impact for Native Americans in Chicago is the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. So this is an amazing piece of legislation where white people just decided, Native Americans are not human, and if they're ever going to make it, they need to stop pretending to be Native Americans. They need to be assimilated into the white American population, and we need to disperse the Native American tribes. So by now, in the 1950s, these are peoples that are located on reservations. We need to disperse them off of their residential land and make them move into big cities. So in addition to stealing children, this forced relocation happened throughout the United States. And so Chicago, being centrally located, became the hub for lots of different native groups. And so actually, Chicago has not only one of the largest urban populations of Native Americans, they also have a very diverse population of Native Americans. Um, and in fact, the American Indian Center shown on this slide is the first urban American Indian Center in the country. And Uptown, one of the original locations where Native Americans settled, was known as Hillbilly Heaven and Redskin Row when I came to Chicago in the 60s. So in 2018, the population for Chicago was estimated to be about 65,000. And there's just a few uh, Native Americans from the Chicago area in that picture. So when we talk about fugitivity and disenfranchisement, we have first the colonization of the hemisphere, not only North America, but North, Central, and South America by a whole range of European forces, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese. Um, and this is just a brief history pictorially of the transatlantic slave trade. not the only trade that slave that went on. There was also a trans-Pacific slave trade. That's another story that we don't have time to really go into detail. But this bar graph gives you an idea of what we're talking about. When I show this to my grandkids, they just are totally amazed because in their mind, slavery happened millions of years ago, back with dinosaurs. And you can see just from this graphic that we've only spent 14% of our history in British colonial world um, in quote unquote neoliberalism or post Civil Rights Act. About a quarter of the time was spent between the Civil War and the starting of the modern civil rights movement in 1965. But the vast majority of time, 61% of time that Black people were in North America was really spent in chattel slavery. Another way to think about this that I try to explain, I'm 76 years old. I remember as a little girl being placed on the lap of someone who was a slave. I was born in 1948. They were very, very old, but I distinctly remember being placed on their lap and being told that they were born a slave. My grandchildren, who are in their early 20s, never have had that experience. So when we think about what slavery means and how we portray it and how we talk about it, it becomes very difficult now that the actual human memory of that event, most of our time on this continent, is lost to us in terms of actual human beings. So, fugitive is a concept that comes to us from Black studies. And how can I say this in a nice way? You know, academics like to play with words and semantics. It was really an effort in the Black study movement, intellectual academic movement, to make heroic as they should have been fugitives fleeing slavery, people fighting for their freedom. And so I wanted to just quickly review. These are two maps. One is sort of mythical. The right one on the right is more accurate. So mythically, as a young child growing up in the 50s and 60s, the map on the left, which showed Black people enslaved fleeing north to Canada to freedom, this is a myth. And even as a little girl, I was always wondering, like, well, how did they get from Mississippi all the way to Canada? You know, that's a long way. How did that happen? The map on the right is a more accurate picture of what happened. So, in fact, these flights of fugitives across the line did not always have to make it to Canada. You could make it above the Mason-Dixon line. You could make it where slavery was technically illegal or frowned upon, or where you had more allies. So that Harriet Tubman, for example, is in Maryland, and it's a hop, skip, and a jump to make it north of the Mason-Dixon line from there. But also importantly, which is why this slide is up here, is people from Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas, they're not going to Canada, they're going to Mexico. They're going south. They're fleeing south across the Mexican border. They're fleeing south out of the ports in Florida and Louisiana to Cuba and Haiti and other places. So this is part of our history that we don't talk about and doesn't get as much play. But more than three-quarters of slaves that were caught in the Fugitive Slave Act, the act that made it illegal for slaves to flee and made it illegal for them to get help fleeing, sort of like what we do today with immigrants crossing the southern border. But three-quarters of the people actually captured under the Fugitive Slave Act from Texas, those slaves were headed toward Mexico because it was closer. I'll come back to that book in a minute. That's a great book that talks about this Southern Underground Railroad. So fugitivity is an intellectual concept that talks about the idea of escaping systematic control and crossing borders. Taking this image of Harriet Tubman, as seen here, and really generalizing it and say, no, this concept of being a fugitive and raising up people who engaged in fugitive activities is something we should be proud of, something we need to understand, something that is part and parcel of what it means to be Black. It's a symbol of the resistance and survival of Black people in the United States and actually across the diaspora. It's a fundamental part of the conceptualization of Blackness. This is what the Black Studies movement really begins to talk about, I think, in useful ways. But none of these things are brand new. And so the fundamental history of this kind of thinking comes to us from Emile Cesar. I remember reading him in college. Um, and his most famous book, you should get it and read it if you haven't, Discourses on Colonialism. So he was born in Martinique, a French colony, and again begins to discuss the real impact of colonialism as a system and an international system that really destroys people, that denies people's humanity and denies their ability to function at all. The book that Tiffany brought up a little earlier, Fugitive Pedagogy, I think this is a wonderful book that really goes into detail on the role of Carter G. Woodson and other things about one of the philosophical approaches that the Black community has had for generations on how to deal with these crazy white people. That's really what it comes down to. How does that happen? how do you survive? How did your mother survive? How did your granddaddy survive? How did your great granddaddy survive? How is that possible? And so Carter G. Woodson, as you may or may not know, is the father of Black History Month that we're about to enter in February. Chosen, by the way, by him because those were the birthdays for Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. But he points out about how it was amazing the level of literacy that existed among emancipated slaves at the end of the Civil War. And this wasn't by accident, that fugitivity means that you carefully protect and pass on subversive practices of ordinary Black social life. This is true not only in the United States, but it's true across the African diaspora, and I would argue it's true across all colonial people. So this is an activities that undermine and fight against white supremacy and the surveillance of whites and the domination of whites. And it's a basic rhetorical frame for talking about revolution and resistance. It's really an effort that crystallizes the effort of Black Americans, at least, to pursue a fight for humanity. This is a great book, even if you're not a teacher. And again, if you haven't read Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, you should read it. The other kinds of antecedents to this concept of fugitivity existed throughout our history. This happens to be David Walker, again, famous. He was a free Black. His father was a slave. His mother was a free woman. And since the status of Black children was determined by the mother, since his mother was free, he was born free. And so he functions in the world, and he's famous for this remarkable appeal, the appeal to colored citizens of the world, where he clearly spells out in 1829 the evils of colonialism, the problems with white supremacy and racism, and how it violates what the white supremacists and racists claim they follow, Christianity and notions of freedom and individual liberty. So again, an important part of this concept of fugitivity. Frederick Douglass's owner, according to Frederick Douglass's work, is supposed to have said that if a slave runs away, they're stealing themselves. They are fugitives, criminals, because they're stealing property that belongs to the slave owner. So think about the concept of what that means. If you learn how to read, if you leave chattel slavery, if you move to a different country in the world, you are stealing something from your oppressor. Disenfranchisement is an interesting concept too. And I'm glad that Tiffany talked about not simply the issue of voting. If you go back to the original meaning of franchisement, it means freedom from servitude or restraint. So disenfranchisement means an act of taking someone's freedom, depriving people of the rights and privileges to fully participate in the world as a full human being, not simply the civil rights that we talk about, the right to vote, etc., the right to sign a contract, the right to testify in court. All of these Other kinds of rights, in addition to the one to vote, are things that have been denied people of color in North America for all of our history. Again, um, we want to make sure that we learn how to think about and connect up these concepts together. You'll know some of these pictures happened under Obama, some under Trump. The pictures of people hanging there are lynchings that went on during the period of Reconstruction in the Southwest. We'll talk about a book about that in 1 second. So during the same historical period that the lynching of blacks, former slaves, increased in the South, the rate of lynching of Mexicans in the southwestern part of the United States was about the same order of magnitude. And this is something that was not really understood by the general American public, or even much of academia until the 50s and 60s. And again, it's important to remember why this was not understood. The only way we know how many blacks were lynched is because of the work of the NAACP. So starting in the early 1900s, the NAACP would scour Southern newspapers, Southern white newspapers, looking for the ad or the comment, Saturday night, John Jones was lynched for whatever reason. And so that's the major mechanism by looking at those newspaper records of recording the numbers of black people that were lynched. Those estimates are probably much smaller than they should be. The NAACP did not have a whole bunch of people, if anybody, who read Spanish. They didn't look at the Spanish newspapers. It's later on that some Chicano scholars begin looking at Spanish language newspapers from the same period and document this history of lynching. Lynching as a vigilante activity, an expression, a free expression of white supremacy, went on all over the United States, not just against blacks and Mexicans, but against other people, Native Americans, poor whites, and Chinese, for example. In fact, the largest single mass lynching that we know about happened in LA, in a Chinese neighborhood. So here's three books. I don't have time to talk about them all. The first one here is about the lynching of Mexican Americans. The second one, which I really don't have to talk about, this is a classic about the history of Asians in the United States. I recommend it if you haven't read it. And I've already mentioned South to Freedom. So I want to pause at this slide for a minute because this is a slide that looks at civil rights legislation. It doesn't start in 1964, 65, which is what happened in my lifetime, maybe not in some of your lifetimes, but the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Housing Act. Now, this starts with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, for that matter, after the Civil War, that the ones that declare basic rights for blacks, that establish birthright citizenship. But look at all of that. The first KKK Act of Civil Rights, 1870. The second KKK Act for Civil Rights, 1871. Here's a 1875. There's a Civil Rights Act of 1957. We should learn something here. These Civil Rights Acts are not working. Okay. And even the notion of civil rights as opposed to human rights and full franchisement is another problem that we have in the history of this country. So these problems of a lack of rights, the disenfranchisement of a whole people, the continuing, even though chattel slavery is abolished, to make the very existence as a black person a criminal just by the fact that you exist and you're living and breathing. You don't have to do anything else to be criminal. This is something that is buried and molded into American history. Frantz Fanon, another critical foundational writer and thinker around this issue of fugitivity, writes, when we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply for many reasons. We can no longer breathe. This march here, which is only part of it, this is a silent march of 1917. This is in New York City. A few months before this, in East St. Louis, A group of whites went into the black community and murdered people. Not an unusual event. It happened all over the country many times, but this happens to be the response in New York City. And in this particular march, the women marched separate from the men. I don't think I have a picture, so this is the beginning of the march where the women behind them are the men dressed in black. Think about how many people, 8,000, 10,000, 15,000 people marching in silence in the streets of New York, protesting the massacre in East St. Louis. But it's not just East St. Louis. This is a time period where lots of places are just murdering blacks. This is our own Chicago race riot of 1919. These are photographs from the South Side where here's a Negro man being killed with being stoned to death with these bricks near his house. You know the story, I hope, those of you from Chicago know the story of people swimming in Lake Michigan and some black person crossing over some imaginary segregated line in the water. And so the whites went crazy. But this preceded a whole series of riots on the part of whites. This is after World War One. So I wanted to mention this because this is something I think you should do. Look up this report. I think I might have a better reference to it in a minute. It's the Commission's report of 1922. It talked about riots in Springfield, Illinois. It talked about what was going on in Chicago. It talked about the criminal justice system. Um, and it talks about the layout of the black community when these riots occurred. Um, the book here is not about the riot of 1919. This is a more recent book that looks at the structural conditions that created Chicago inequality. This is a Negro in Chicago. If you Google that Negro in Chicago report, the report will come up. It's a couple of hundred pages. Published in 1922. It had a biracial committee that looked at these riots. So it wasn't just all whites. It was a white and black group that looked at the riots. And basically, here's some of the quotes from it where they're talking about why is it some communities have more crime than other communities? What's going on with causing the crime? And one thing that the report is very clear about is that the cause of the riot and much of the crime in Chicago happened from Chicago street gangs, these athletic clubs, white organizations to which the great Mayor Daley belonged, among other people. So the report made recommendations. You can read the report. They recommended that they rid the black community of certain illegal activities, gambling, prostitutions, etc. They recommended that there be better cooperation between the city and park police, and that they not allow whites to harass blacks, and if harassment goes on, they be arrested. And they recommend especially that the South Side athletic clubs be controlled so that they don't go around committing racial violence. Of course, those recommendations weren't followed. But you can read the report, I think it's a useful lesson to ask yourself, that report was in 1922. How many other reports have we had since then examining various problems? The Tulsa Massacre is also another example. There are many, but I picked out Tulsa for an important reason. First, just this week, a new 126-page report that you can see here, the link is there on this slide, was released by the Department of Justice that investigated this Tulsa riot. And what they said clearly and conclusively is this was not a mob of people getting excited and things getting out of control. This was organized and planned in almost military fashion to burn down and destroy this neighborhood in Tulsa. What I haven't read the report completely, but what I want to say to you is you should ask yourself, why was there a riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma? Why was there a Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1920s? Why wasn't there a Black Wall Street in Philadelphia or New York City or Washington, D.C.? What was going on with Tulsa that there was a Black Wall Street there and considered so dangerous that the white forces decided to wipe it out? Um, so one of the histories behind Oklahoma and the Tulsa riot is that Native Americans in the southeastern part of the United States, the so-called civilized tribes, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, six or seven quote unquote civilized tribes owning land, having court systems in Georgia and Virginia and the Carolinas were marched under President Andrew Jackson west of the Mississippi in the Trail of Tears in 1830. And many of those peoples were taken to Oklahoma. And in fact, Oklahoma is really should all be an Indian reservation. That's one of the first big places where the resettlements occurred. Some of those Indian people, not all, but some of them owned slaves. Some of those communities absorbed free blacks who either bought their way out of slavery or escaped from slavery. But there were some who did own slaves themselves. But in any case, in 1830, with the Trail of Tears, they were marched west of the Mississippi with their slaves or with their black citizens of their tribes. And so after the Civil War, you remember when we were promised 40 acres of a mule and then they said we didn't really mean it? Well, the white people told the Native Americans, yo, you not only have to free your slaves, you got to give them 40 acres and a mule. And that's what happened. So in Oklahoma, there was an unusual concentration of blacks, especially after the Civil War when emancipation occurred, who were given land, who had land because they had been enslaved by these Native Americans. And what was on that land, we'll find out a few decades later, is oil. So it's land and oil that are the fuel for the Tulsa Black Wall Street. So it's not an accident that that's where it happened. That's the structural conditions that created Black Wall Street there in Tulsa. And again, not in Philadelphia, not in New York, not in Washington, D.C. After hundreds of people were murdered, men, women, and children, and the city, this neighborhood burned down, the residents were gathered up and put in an internment camp by force. They didn't go there nicely. The National Guard took them as prisoners, men and women, and they made them work. The first work they had them do was clean up the mess that the riot had made. So someone comes in, they murder your relatives and families, they burn down your house and property, and then you have to work cleaning that up. And if you refuse to work, you're arrested for vagrancy. So this history is a history we know, unfortunately. We don't know it as well as we should, but it's not an unusual history. I could spend another 10 or 12 weeks talking about all these kind of incidents. So you have the concept of being not human. If you're Native American, you're not human. If you're indigenous Mexican, you're not human. If you're slaves imported from Africa, you're not human. You're subhuman. And this concept of racial capitalism, again, it's not a new concept. Du Bois, I think, is the first Black American that really talks about this. This is a quote from his work, Black Reconstruction. Black labor becomes the foundation stone, not only for the Southern social structure. So it's not only that Black slaves enrich Southern slave owners. No. Black slavery is the foundation for Northern manufacture and commerce. It's the foundation for the English factory system, for European commerce in general, for the buying and selling on a worldwide scale. New cities are built on the results of Black labor, and the new labor problem involving all white labor arose in both Europe and America. When we think about what American values are perpetuating these injustices, this is Kamara Jones's list. I think it's a perfectly reasonable list. We focus as Americans on the narrow rights of the individual. We think liberty is defined by what happens to the individual. We don't think of liberty and freedom on a population basis. We're a historical people. We ignore and reject history. You know, right now, I guess almost half of the country is in denial about what happened, the last time Trump got in. But in any case, we can't remember history even if it's only a few years ago. We're fundamentally committed to a white supremacist ideology. That's an ideology that says it is not possible. It is impossible for the body of a black person, of an Asian person. It's impossible for them to be human. We continue to perpetuate this myth of American exceptionalism, which I find that's the most irritating thing that I find about American values. What makes us think we're the best nation in the world? I don't even understand where that notion comes across. We believe in a myth of meritocracy, which is blatantly wrong. Uh, I, I know people that are working hard every day, two or three jobs, and they still are poor. It has nothing to do with their merit. We believe in a zero-sum game. We believe that if you get something, then I have to lose something. And we don't think very clearly about the future. So we have fires burning in LA, even though there have been wildfires all across California for decades. And we knew that this was only a matter of time when this happens. I want to acknowledge we lost a leader today, someone who really understood these issues well. Jose Cha Jimenez died last week. And for those of you who don't know, he is one of he actually is the founder of the Young Lords, which started here in Chicago. And there's a picture of him as a young person, but there's a picture of him a few years ago with Frank Chapman. So Frank Chapman's a little older than me and Cha Cha. So the Young Lords started off as a street gang and really then began to organize themselves into a liberation struggle. Again, if we don't have time to look at this, go back to this slide, check out these YouTube things, especially the Chicago Stories documentary, which talks about the Young Lords in Chicago. You can see an interview with Cha Jimenez himself. The documentary for New York City, which is where the New York chapter of the Young Lords uh, worked. This is a documentary of their takeover of Lincoln Hospital. So actually, the New York City chapter spent a lot of time and efforts around public health issues. So that's good. Here are two excellent books. One is on the Young Lords. The second one is on the Black Panthers, but it looks at the Black Panthers' input and contributions to health and primary care. Two excellent books if you're interested in health. So, what are we talking about here? We have this history. We say we're in public health school. We say we're concerned about the health of the public. What does that mean? What is science? We're worried about. We have these. We have these not very bright people about to come into national office, and who are arguing about what science is and what science isn't. I think science is a social institution like any other institution. It's not a religion, which sometimes people in public health and medicine try to treat it like a religion. It's not really like a religion. It is a social institution. It's influenced by whatever else goes on in society. And we have to really remember that and challenge ourselves as public health people to be careful what we talk about and to be careful how we say it. People don't just trust you because you have an MD after your name or because you're working in the clinic or because you come from their neighborhood. That's not good enough. You have to have a better understanding of what's going on and be able to communicate that to get people to trust you. So, in any case, whatever you think science is and whatever the arguments are we're having in science, you have to understand the history. Because science is basically a debate, a discussion, really arguments that often result in people being imprisoned and killed around how we think the world works. Whether you think the sun rotates around the earth, which is what most people, Europeans, thought for many, many, many years, or whether you think the earth rotates around the sun. And if you ask Galileo, sometimes he went to jail for what he thought. So understanding the history of science is just as important, and it's part and parcel of the history that we've been talking about. There is no difference or distinction. Again, three basic books on the history of public health in the English-speaking world, mostly in the United States. We don't have a lot of history books broad like this, so you could easily read these two or three books if you're in public health. We should stop for a moment and ask ourselves, well, what the hell do we mean by health? If we think that the people's health is wrong, we talk about an epidemic of injustice, what do we mean by health? We we have here, sort of Webster's dictionary about what health might mean. You can see the WHO 1948 definition: health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I will tell you, when I started medical school, in the first year of medical school, they put this up on a slide and they said, this doesn't apply to us in the United States. Found it a fascinating notion. We're above this definition of health. But I like the People's Charter preamble as a better definition of health. Another document that you should Google and pay attention to. Health is a social, economic, and political issue, and above all, a fundamental human right. Inequality, poverty, exploitation, violence, and injustice are at the root of ill health and the deaths of poor and marginalized people. Health for all means that powerful interests have to be challenged, that globalization has to be opposed, and that political and economic priorities have to be drastically changed. That is my definition of health. That is clearly a provocative definition of health. It's not a neutral definition of health. It is a definition that takes a position. All the definitions take a position. The question is, what position are you going to take when you think about what health is? Some more basic books. If you're starting off, some of you I know are starting your career in the School of Public Health. This is one of your first classes. And even if you're about to graduate this semester, here's some basic books that I think will help you. Nancy Krieger is an important person in our field, and she'll be coming to visit us later on this semester. So keep an eye out for when that happens. I don't remember the date off the top of my head. She talks about an eco-social theory in terms of understanding the population health of people. What makes one population healthy and another population sick? How do we figure that out? What are the factors? Again, we don't have time to go into depth about this, but this is a graphic representation of her particular theory, one of many theories. Here's some other books that talk about this. So the key thing to remember, and here I have to apologize on the part of all of the School of Public Health faculty because we get sloppy. Public health is not a religion. And we do not teach you in our School of Public Health, or most of them, I don't think well enough. You should be trying to learn what we are arguing about. That's where you really learn what's going on. And it's not often what you think it is, but there are arguments going. Think of it as when you were a little child and your parents were arguing. You might not know what they were arguing about, but you could tell they were arguing. Well, that's what's going on in the real world of public health, and it's important that you learn this. I'm leaving this slide up here because I want to point out to you Jaime Braille's important book. In the world today, certainly since World War II, the most advanced group of thinking around population health is, in my opinion, the Latin American social epi movement, social medicine movement. And Jaime Braille is one of the leaders of that. And this is an excellent summary of that whole way of thinking in that movement in English. If you're like me and only can read in English, I'm not literate in Spanish, this is an excellent place to start. Hopefully, many of you have heard of Dr. Jones. This is a sort of a medical doctor's definition of racism. You know, us doctors were not that bright, and we like things sort of too simplistic. So there are much more nuanced approaches to racism than how we think about it. But nonetheless, this is a good definition, I think, that works for people in public health and medicine. The key thing is that the development of racism and capitalism are linked, and racism is basically a hierarchical system. It's not an individual disease. It's not a set of prejudices on an individual level. We're talking about a system of hierarchy. Anti-Black racism plays a critical role in the world's history, but that's not the only form of racism that exists. Racism is not binary. It's not just black and white. And so looking at structural racism becomes important. And we've talked about racial capitalism a little bit. This is something that you should explore more. It's creeping more and more into the language of public health, not enough or not fast enough. But again, this is an old concept that goes back, in this case, to Du Bois, where he talks about the role of racial capitalism. More books that you should think about reading. You feel burdened by all these books, but you have a long time to read them, so don't worry. And here are two other quick, simple, short books to read looking at indigenous people's history in the United States. And this excellent book by Paul Ortiz that links together the history of the Latinx people in the United States and African American history. So, what is going on here? This is the US southern border in the early part of the century, last century. And these men are being, I'm sure they have the covering their genitals only because someone's taking a picture. They're being examined by the border guards because we have to be, so think about it. We're importing all of these Mexicans to come in and labor and work in the United States, but they're dirty Mexicans, so we have to inspect them. So this is what would happen. They would be stripped naked. They'd be examined by border guards. They'd be drenched in chemicals, DDT and other bad chemicals to supposedly clean them. And so this went on for years and years and years. And we used kerosene and DDT, sodium cyanide. It's disgusting. In 1917, there was a riot called the Bath Riots because the same kind of process went on with women coming north of the border to work in people's homes and laundries and other places. And there was a young woman in her late teens, early 20s, who one day said, we're not doing this shit. And so a riot broke out protesting this kind of demeaning treatment of people simply crossing a border to work. So again, think about what it means to be a fugitive crossing the border. So the history of immigration in this country is a long one, and it's one with lots of myth. We are not really a nation of immigrants. We're a nation of settlers. There really is a difference between a settler and an immigrant. The first act passed by the Congress of the United States in 1790 is this Nationality Act, and it basically said you could only be naturalized and become an American citizen if you were a free white person. Foundation of the nation, a free white person. Who was defined as white then is a little different than who's defined as white today. Again, another long story that we don't completely have time for. You've heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, where for the first time we particularly pick a specific group of people, Chinese or anyone Asian, to be honest with you, but Chinese specifically, and say, you cannot be an American citizen. And as a matter of fact, we don't even want you coming here. But you can see the other acts around immigration that go on through the 20s at the same time that the eugenics movement is at its peak. And so never was this meant to be a nation of immigrants. It was always used to exclude people who were subhuman. The once and soon to be again president is about to start illegal deportations in this country, something that we should all be embarrassed about, something that Democratic and Republican presidents have done, including President Obama. So we shouldn't act as though anybody has a rational approach to immigration nowadays. But in 1929, we saw a massive deportation of Mexican Americans and a few Mexicans from the United States. This is as we go into the Great Depression. It's conservatively estimated that 2 million people were deported. 2 million people of Mexican ancestry were deported from the United States. And they think that most of them, 1.2 million, had been born in the United States. And in California especially, but other parts in the West, raids were conducted in the communities, okay, not just in the workplaces, in the communities. People came in at midnight. They were loaded on trains and buses and just moved south. Um, so they knew how to do that in 1929. They know how to do that today. It's not until 1952 that immigrants of other than black or white could become U.S. citizens. So really, the Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't abolished until 1952 after World War II. And so again, we're not a nation of welcoming immigrants. We never have been. This is a Chicago police station. Just to remind you that Chicago is in the middle of the country. We've had immigrants for over a century. In terms of immigrants from our hemisphere, mostly Mexican, when the Mexican Revolution happens. And then in the 40s through the 60s, the Bracero program, which brought Mexican and Puerto Rican workers to work in the Chicago area. And then after this Vietnam War, you see more and more populations from other parts of Latin America, Guatemala and Colombia especially. But as you know, in from August 2022 until, oh, I don't know, I think the last time I saw a good figure was from the early in 2024, 30,000 Venezuelan immigrants were sent by the governor of Texas to Chicago. Now, look at these people. And remember that map I showed you of the transatlantic slave trade. So some of these people just got off the boat on one of the islands, or in Venezuela, or in Mexico, not in Georgia. These are the same people. And it's interesting to me that how we think about these issues has gotten so twisted. So I know some Mexican American people in Chicago, Chicagoans, who saw some of these Venezuelan immigrants looking just like me, and they began to speak Spanish to them, and they were in shock. I was surprised that they spoke Spanish. And then you see Black Americans from Mississippi look at these people and are surprised that they're coming from Venezuela. These particular Venezuelans that are hanging on the South Side and stuff in these police stations, they don't look that much different than people from Mississippi or Louisiana. And we have to think about, what does it mean to talk about these immigrants as a different group of people? What does it mean when you have unity on the South Side of Chicago between Chinese women, Mexican women, Black women, all screaming that they don't want these immigrants in Chicago? So we have to think about what it means when you have an oppressed people screaming against their own oppression, their own folks. This is somebody's cousin. They just got separated on the boat. So many issues that exist today have their roots in the past. All of the issues that exist today have their roots in the past. This is a picture of young lords, women in the young lords, fighting for reproductive rights, not abortion rights, reproductive rights, that Puerto Rican women especially were forced and abused during sterilization, as were Mexican women and Black women. And so our history with abortion rights is a little different. We know the maternal mortality is stratified by race and ethnicity in this country, not a surprise like so many other things. Fannie Lou Hamer, a victim of illegal, or of a Mississippi appendectomy and illegal sterilization without her permission or knowledge. Here are two leading physicians that I want to call out that worked in this area of reproductive rights, not abortion rights. There's a difference. Dr. Constance Redbird Urey is a Cherokee Choctaw physician. She worked in the Indian Health Service and in the 70s, and she documented in the groups that she was looking at 40% of Native American women and 10% of the men were sterilized by the Indian Health Service, by policies of the Indian Health Service. This is like killing the Indians still with these taking away reproductive rights. Helen Rodriguez Trias, a Puerto Rican pediatrician by training, one of the first actually Latino president of the American Public Health Association, really strongly fought for reproductive rights. I want to remind you that in addition to being sterilized disproportionately, the birth control trials took place on the island of Puerto Rico. So at the time when Helen was working, a third of Puerto Rican women had been sterilized. And then we come to 2020. This is a demonstration outside of an ICE detention center where women who are in these ICE detention centers have a complaint. They're taken to see a local doctor. In this case, and the local doctor was tying their tubes and sterilizing them. Dawn Wooten is a licensed practical nurse, a black woman. She became a whistleblower. She saw that these women were being sterilized and they didn't understand or know that they had been sterilized. And she thought that was wrong and presumably had some knowledge of history of sterilization among black people and blew the whistle on this particular practice. And some other great books that you ought to pay attention to, especially if you're interested. This precarious prescriptions, I think, goes a lot into some of the reproductive rights. So, one of our problems as we think about epidemics of injustice, and now that all the white women are worried that they lost Roe v. Wade, for many of us, Roe v. Wade was a myth anyway. Okay. We had the Hyde Amendment. You couldn't, if you were a poor woman on Medicaid, Medicaid wouldn't pay for an abortion. If you lived in a rural community, it was hard to get to an abortion, even when they used to be legal in your state. So today, the fact that Roe v. Wade has been overturned is a major attack on women. There's no question. But one of the fundamental problems that we did is too many people, let me be clear, too many white women fought for abortion rights and didn't give a shit about reproductive rights. It's black women and Native American women and Mexican American women who said, no, we want reproductive rights. We want to be able to have children when we would want to have children and avoid pregnancies when we feel that we shouldn't. And that's a very different concept than just abortion rights. This is Abigail Echo Hawk out of Seattle, where they have a great center on indigenous health. And they have really been pushing the concept of data genocide. Because if you don't count the deaths, if you pretend they don't exist as a people, then that's just another form of genocide. And so they have a great document, you can Google it here, that looks at some of the problems of data and how to report and collect data. This is a major problem. How do we disaggregate the data? We often don't even know what's going on with Native Americans. And of course, Native Americans are a whole bunch of different groups of people. We rarely disaggregate the data to look at what's going on among the Navajo versus what's going on among Sioux or other tribal groups. So this push for research and data justice is very important. And it means that you have to think about science and the questions we ask very differently than Western science. That's why that Jaime Braille book is so useful, and other efforts in literatures around decolonizing science and decolonizing jails data. So in order to have data justice, you have to make sure that you're not just using paradigms that are set out by Western, so-called Western science, but we have to really be able to incorporate other ways of thinking, of which there are many around the world. And we have to make sure that there are basic rights involved. The right to do research, the right to be heard, the right to know what's going on, the right to involve. So when we talk about community-based research, all science should be community-based. The problem is that science is based on one community. That's a problem. And so then it's not very good science. I want to make sure we have time for questions here. Just some more examples. Here's another example from the Chicago area. This is the Chicago's Toxic Donut. These are the Art Gale Garden projects built in 1945 specifically for Black veterans returning from the war. It was built on landfill. So hear me. They built this especially for Black veterans who had just risked their lives to save democracy. And they built it on landfill, on a hazardous wasteland. They knew it when they built it. Art Gale Gardens is surrounded. This is some old data, but still 50 landfills, 382 industrial facilities, couple hundred leaking underground storage tanks. There's a river going in. Here's Hazel Johnson, who was a community activist. We lost her a few years ago. She worked and lived in Art Gale Garden. She was early mentor to Barack Obama. I'm not sure how proud she would be of that, but anyway, I don't think he listened to her either. She was a thorn in the side of the Chicago waste industry. She was a wife and mother of 7 children. She's considered one of the mothers of the environmental justice movement in the country. It's a pleasure that I treasure of being able to work with her for a number of decades. And in her community, um, we had a recent victory a few years ago when Lightfoot was mayor, when the General Iron here on the left, on the north side, wanted to relocate over here to the south side. They wanted to leave the rich white community and take this process of recycling over to the far south side, Oakdale Garden area. Uh, and and there were protests. So there were demonstrations for years. These is just part of the demonstrations. This is a community that's Black and Mexican American working to prevent this plant from relocating. And that's actually a victory that we won. Here's another great Chicago book that looks at garbage wars, environmental justice struggles in Chicago. They go back a long way. This is an alley near University of Illinois. This is a Chicago alley, and this is what it looked like. And so this is so critical that Jane Addams arranged to have herself appointed as Chicago's first women garbage inspector because she figured in 1898 because she figured until you get this kind of stuff cleaned up where you just have animals, dead animals, raw sewage and stuff in these alleys, you're going to continue to have disease and problems. And so one of the tasks of Hull House and Jane Addams was to make sure that they paid attention to environmental justice issues and get that cleaned up. So every era and every piece of legislation, every structural part of society is foundationally based on capitalism and racism. This is just an example of structural racism in the New Deal, where agriculture and domestic workers were excluded. So think about where most Blacks were working as the New Deal gets rolled out. They were working in agricultural and domestic work. This is a structural problem. Um, Other things in terms of wages, etc., all of these things were structured so that Blacks were kept in low wage positions. So when we think about U.S. history, this is how I think about it in a very crude way. We have the struggle to be considered human before the Civil War. This is a struggle of all people that weren't considered white. Uh, and then we had the struggle to abolish slavery and then secure freedom. So once you abolish chattel slavery, you still had to struggle to secure actual freedom after the Civil War. That's the first Reconstruction. And so again, read Du Bois's book. We lost that battle. It was a battle. It was a mighty battle, but we lost the battle soon. It wasn't a decade or two before we lost that. It's not only that promises weren't kept, things were actually rolled back. Victories that were won, like the right to vote, were taken away. Then we have a struggle for human rights before World War II, and then after World War II, again, uh, when you think you've made a major advance where you have a whole world in a decolonial process, colonies falling right and left, the so-called modern civil rights movement of the 1960s. Again, sort of the second Reconstruction in the United States never went as far as the first Reconstruction, in my opinion. And that's why today I think what we need is a third Reconstruction, because we've gone back again. So, what are we talking about in terms of population health? This is from Frederick Ingalls, another important book that if you haven't read, you really ought to. The Condition of the Working Class in England. But I won't read all of this, but he goes through some of the problems that poor working class, these happen to be white people in England, had. And he says here that what goes on is really murder, but murder remains. I have not approved that society in England daily and hourly commits with the working man's organs with perfect correctness, characterized as social murder. He goes on. When as here and elsewhere I speak of society as a whole, I mean, of course, the ruling party, power of society, the class which holds special political and social control and bears, therefore, the responsibility for the condition that people are in. Here's Paul Farmer, another great person that we lost a few years ago. Any of his books you should read. They'll come up on the next slide. But again, he points out that human rights violations are not accidents. These aren't oversights. Oh, we're a great country. We believe in freedom. Oh, whoops, we just made that little mistake about slavery. Whoops, we just made that little mistake and we committed genocide against Native Americans. That's not how it works. It's not random. It's not an accident. They're a symptom of deeper pathologies that are linked to the social conditions. He always talks about Haiti. Haiti committed the first sin of freeing itself out of slavery, becoming the first Black republic, and they're paying for it even today. Again, any of his books are good. I encourage you to read them if you haven't. I like what Chris Hedges says. And this was true a few years ago, and it's still true today, unfortunately. What is taking place is not neglect. It's ineptitude. It's not ineptitude. It is not policy failure. A lot of public health people think it's not policy failure. It is murder. It is murder because it is premeditated. It is murder because a conscious choice was made by the global ruling class to extinguish life rather than protect it. It is murder because profit, despite the hard statistics, the growing climate disruptions, and the scientific modeling, is deemed more important than human life and human survival. So when we think about wars and death, this is a map of current active wars going on in the world. And again, a few years ago, we only thought the only war that was important was the war in Ukraine. So how can we possibly stand here as public health people, and especially as Americans, and fail to address the occupation of Palestine and the active genocide that's going on there? We can't. And if we don't understand the link between that and our history and what happened with the Treaty of Chicago or what happened with the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendment, if we can't make a connection, if we can't draw a line between that activity in South Africa and our own country's history, we really are vacant in terms of how we think about it. There's no other way to call this, and the question is, what should we be doing about it as a nation that is paying for what you see before you? Oppression and power are critical to understanding the epidemics of injustice. They're critical to understanding what we're faced with. Oppression, I like this definition, is malicious or unjust treatment or exercise of power, often under the guise of governmental authority. And power is defined simply as an act to have influence over others. So we need to be worried not just about domestic terrorism, we need to be worried about our ability to actually remember a few years ago. This is an act of patriotism today. This is something that a big portion of the country thinks was just a few people having some free speech expression. So, what do we need to think about? What do we need to learn? Well, first, we need to have a better understanding of history. Not just history of wars and treaties and immigration, history of science, history of medicine, history of what we do, what fields we work in. History informs everything. We have to be able to understand and analyze structural determinants. We don't talk about structural determinants in our health professions. That's hard to do if you just start looking at laws that are passed in Congress. We have to be able to ask questions and question our assumptions and not be afraid of doing that. We have to be able to communicate with a wide array of disciplines. All the disciplines have something to contribute to our understanding of human society and human health. And we have to be able to communicate to the general public. And what should we be doing? Well, like I said, next Monday, number 47 will come into office again. It is mind-boggling to me, I'm sorry, to think that a people could, having went through one term of Trump, can go through them again. It's mind-boggling on one level, but it's not as mind-boggling as it ought to be. Because the differences between what is going on with Trump and what is going on with the Republican and Democratic, the old Republican and the Democratic Party are not that dissimilar. What happened, one way to think about what happened with this election is a minority of the American people, because don't forget it was a minority even of voters, even though he won the popular vote. But think about how many people don't vote. But in any case, a significant minority voted for a third party called Trump. They were upset and pissed off over what was normally going on, I think correctly so, in sort of the business as usual Republican and Democratic corporate approach to the world. And so they chose a third party. They chose a third party of the right, a party that threatens us with fascism, but nonetheless a third party. And what we should be asking ourselves is why, in fact, can't we raise the questions and present some answers and possibilities that are not the old corporate political parties' answers, but that actually have some pathway to freedom. So we need to learn and teach history to understand how we got here. We need to be clear about what racism is and how to have anti-racist campaigns. We need to be able to explicitly state the values you believe in. You don't have to believe in my values, but be clear about what you think and what you believe in. Start where you are. If you're in school, start there. If you have a job, start there. Start where you are. And you have to understand the systems and the structures to support the systems in order to know how to dismantle the system. How is the issue that you're passionate about connected to other issues? How did the problem you see get developed with other problems? You have to be willing to dare to fight for a new world, a world at peace where social justice is the law of the land.